It's time to eat.
What are you hungry for?
Sit down and get ready to consume an abundance of fantasy football knowledge from Ross Tucker and John Daigle.
Feed me now. I'm starving.
On the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast.
Yeah, let's eat, baby. It is the Fantasy Feast Eating Podcast presented by DraftKings, the show that's so nice. We do it twice during the NFL season. I'm Ross Tucker, former NFL offensive lineman. You know that, at Ross Tucker NFL. You can always follow any of our programming, including Greg Cosell, the civilian GOAT, on the Ross Tucker Football Podcast today by following at Ross Tucker Pod. We're available on Vizio and all kinds of, shout out to our new viewers on Vizio. Obviously, all the other ones already watch us, youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL, and wherever our show and podcast can be found. New co-host starting this season. Man, he was awesome episode 1. It got me fired up for episode 2. The guy John Daigle, at NotJDaigle, Daigle, from EstablishTheRun.com, formerly Roto World. Just like the guys, Adam Levitan, Evan Silva over there. Use the code FEAST to get 5% off the oodles and oodles of terrific information they have at EstablishTheRun.com. I bet a bunch of you are already subscribers over there, but if you're not, you should be. We should get into 9 more games, John, starting with the Jags and the Dolphins down there in Florida.
And let's start with the Jaguars side of the ball, because this is a game I'm excited about. It's natural for NFL quarterbacks to struggle against pressure, but Trevor Lawrence last year was one of the handful of players that became a pumpkin under duress, completing 71% of his passes from a clean pocket compared to 45% when he was under pressure. But we know this Dolphins pass rush is lacking the playmakers, including Bradley Chubb, who's beginning the year on the PUP list, and Christian Wilkins, who left to the Raiders in free agency. So I think Lawrence and this Jaguars passing offense is going to have immense success through the air this year. And this game in particular, the sleeper is Gabe Davis, who was quietly on the field with Lawrence in the preseason for every snap that he played. I do know he didn't catch a pass in that game he started with Lawrence, but he at least saw 2 targets, both of which came in the red zone. So Gabe Davis and Jaguars passing attack is who was on my radar this week.
Love it. What about when the Dolphins have the ball?
And we know exactly where the ball is going to go. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Raheem Mostert, and Devon Achane. The Dolphins even only kept 4 active receivers on their roster, and I believe that means that all of the hype about Achane getting wide receiver routes, as they did use him as such in camp, is going to come to fruition in this game. Yes, he'll likely regress after recording records in yards per attempt and touchdown rate last year, especially as a rookie. But Achane is one of those guys, similar to Chris Johnson, who everyone remembers drafting, that even on limited touches can still win your week. And so we know who to play in Miami, and I think, again, because of the game script and the fact that I think the Jaguars' passing attack will push back, all the guys in Miami that you wanted to start anyhow, it's no secret you're just going to start them this week.
Let's dive into the next game as we talk about week 1, the NFL, Carolina and New Orleans.
And Derek Carr, historically, has struggled in his 4 matchups against Panthers DC, who was previously Broncos DC when Carr played for the Raiders, Ajiro Evero, completing only 62.5% of his passes for 6.3 yards per attempt. But at least to begin the year, until I see how this Saints pass protection holds up, I just want to close my eyes, plug my ears, and bet on something new. Because last year, nothing new or intuitive under Pete Carmichael. But this season, we get new offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak, who I do believe will be at least average in pre-snap motion, play action, and more modern concepts on offense. And I think that begins this week, especially that Carolina is already dealing with injuries in their secondary. Starting cornerback Dane Jackson, safety Xavier Woods. Remember, they also shipped all-pro Brian Burns to the Giants this offseason. So I do think Derek Carr, Chris Olave, and Rashid Shaheed will be the most successful players for the Saints in this game. Shaheed has only played 10 games where he's run a route on over 80% of dropbacks, but he did average an 18.5% target share and double-digit fantasy points in those starts. So I think this is the beginning of Shaheed being a wide receiver 3 or 4 every week, despite the fact he was drafted after the top 100 picks in fantasy this year.
What about when the Panthers have the ball, John?
It's just a belief in Dave Canales because he arguably was the sole reason Geno Smith was revived in 2022 as Canales was Seattle's quarterback coach then, and then last year what he did with Baker Mayfield as the Bucs offensive coordinator, in particular with Mayfield under pressure. So we're just betting on a second-year rejuvenation in Bryce Young. And the best part about the Panthers is that we know exactly where the ball was going to go. Adam Thielen did get off to a hot start, but failed to reach 100 yards in any game once the team returned from their bye from week 6 on, and was closer to a wide receiver 4 in that span than the wide receiver 1 he showed us in the Panthers' first 5 games. In acquiring Deontay Johnson, that's the receiver I believe is going to stand out not only this week, but for the rest of the season and be a dark horse candidate to lead the league in catches, given that Bryce Young really has nowhere else to go with the ball. So Young and Superflex leagues, I don't think people need to get there just yet. But Deontay Johnson, I'm considering a wide receiver 2 or 3 starting in week 1.
What about as we look at the Vikings with Sam Darnold and the Giants who still have Daniel Jones?
And the Vikings have, or the Giants, let's start on that side of the ball since you mentioned Daniel Jones. And it's because I am worried about the Giants' passing game in this one. We know exactly how Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores is going to scheme any team, let alone Daniel Jones, and that's by literally sending the house on every single play. And unfortunately, since he was drafted, Jones has averaged the lowest yards per attempt of any starter in the NFL against the blitz and eaten the second most sacks in that time. So the only player I believe we should be looking at in this one is Malik Neighbors, who identifies as that kind of guy who can play both the boundary and the slot and just soak up targets from the middle of the field, regardless of if Daniel Jones and the rest of the passing attack is struggling.
And then the Vikings with Darnold, what do you think? You think that the receivers still get theirs?
I do, and I think Kevin O'Connell knows exactly what the identity of this offense is, and he proved that last year, even maintaining the league's 7th highest pass play rate when they were within 1 score of their opponent without Kirk Cousins, who missed the entire second half of the season. We haven't seen Darnold play meaningful football in the last calendar year, but over his last 7 starts, including his lone game in Week 18 with the Niners last year, and dating back to a handful of games he started for the Panthers, he has averaged 8 yards per attempt, and for fantasy, 4.5 carries per game, which I believe makes him stand out as a quarterback 2 sneakily for Superflex leagues for everyone trying to decide and someone to start in their flex spot. So it's Darnold, and I believe it's enough in this game at least. The defense will be soft enough to elevate both Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson, especially since T.J. Hawkinson is once again sitting out for at least the team's first 4 games.
So we got the Vegas Raiders and the L.A. Chargers. So fascinated by this game in so many ways. When I think Vegas, I think vodka. Smirnoff is the perfect vodka for crafting delicious cocktails that are easy to make and versatile for any and all fans over 21. Love that they're not only the world's #1 vodka, starting in 1864, an official vodka partner of the NFL, official vodka partner of the Fantasy Feast podcast. Grab a bottle of Smirnoff at your local retailer and head to Smirnoff.com to find recipes of delicious cocktails perfect for game day. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff number 21 vodka, distilled from grain, 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age. Raiders, Chargers, John, go.
The fun part about doing this show in week 1 is that there are a lot we're still monitoring. We will have together much more hard data and info next week. And that includes questioning what's going to happen with these two offenses. Because starting with the Chargers, we know exactly what they want to do and running the ball under Jen Harbaugh and playing sound defense. We just don't exactly know who that's going to be. I believe in week one, we're going to start out with a timeshare and Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, Edwards being the player I'm more confident in starting if you are desperate for a flex or RB3/4. Having said that, it's going to come down to how much volume both these teams will get, because we also know that Antonio Pierce wants to run the ball too. He showed us that last year, especially in the last month of the season, and leaning on Zamir White. My concern all offseason, though, when I was mentioning to fade Zamir White in fantasy drafts, is that he's really just never been the type of player to handle a lot of touches or have the profile we want to chase at his ADP. At Georgia, he only maxed out at 169 touches in a single season and has only 136 touches in his first 2 seasons. And once if the Chargers can gain a lead, what happens to the Raiders offense then? And is Zamir White even on the field, given that at camp and in the preseason, it was Alexander Mattison, who everyone remembers last year, who was actually the team's pass catching back. And so I will say I'm worried about the Raiders passing attack here. You do know who you're starting anyhow. You're still going to start Zamir White, Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers to a lesser extent. But I do think the Chargers have a really good run out, especially in their first 3 games, to just simply play amazing defense and lean on both Edwards and Dobbins.
Let's move it to the Broncos and the Seahawks, where Patrick Surtain just got paid. They better have him lock up one of these Seahawks receivers.
And I think the 2 we should be sneakily high on, because everyone knows to start DK Metcalf. But with Tyler Lockett quietly battling this ominous injury these past few weeks, I do think he'll play. I just wonder how efficient or how limited he will be. And if that's the case, I want to begin buying back in on Jackson Smith-Njigba, last year first-round receiver, from week 1. We at least saw that in his last 2 years at Ohio State, wasn't really playing out wide. And under Shane Waldron last year, did at least run 31% of his routes from out wide as a rookie. The difference was that the way they used him, closer to the line of scrimmage with a 7-yard depth of target, it really didn't allow for explosive routes or downfield plays to return production in fantasy. But I think that changes given the coordinator changed to Ryan Grubb from Washington. So Jackson Smith-Njigba, week 1, is someone I'm very high on. Not only that, but despite the contract extension to Patrick Surtain, this defense with Sean Payton last year for the Broncos allowed a league-high 10 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. And to this point in Seattle, Noah Fant has only played 60 and 55% of the team snaps because it was a 3-headed committee with Will Dissly and Colby Parkinson. But the good news is that those 2 players are now gone to different teams in free agency, and Fant is still a 26-year-old elite athlete who now has no competition. So Fant is someone who we drafted as a sleeper anyhow, most leagues in the last round, but I do think he could be a top 15, top 16 tight end this week, and someone we should probably look at just starting immediately in this game.
What about the Broncos with their new quarterback, Bo Nix, John?
And Bo Nix looked very slick in the preseason, but was also playing against the backups of their teams who were just jostling around to see who was going to make the end of their roster. In week 1, I am concerned about the Broncos' production, in particular through the air. I have all the respect in the world for new Seattle head coach Mike Macdonald, who turned good players in Baltimore into an historically great defense. But he walks into Seattle with maybe even the most talent on that side of the ball. Not only with Tariq Woolen and Devin Witherspoon shutting down the boundaries, but also signing elite coverage linebackers and Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dodson this offseason. We know they have a formidable interior as well. So I think Seattle's defense is the one that's really going to shine under McDonald week 1 and essentially shut out the Broncos offense. Having said that, we know that Sean Payton leaned on Javonte Williams for a career high in touches last year. Williams just averaged a career low in yards per carry because he was coming off that serious torn ACL injury. This year, I am curious, one, if Javonte Williams will be a workhorse, and we're going to find that out in week 1, but how much production will then be leaked to the running backs behind him? Because Jaleel McLaughlin, a sleeper beginning this week, was not only super slippery, like a Austin Eckler for the Broncos offense last year, he did just enough in the passing game where I think there's a chance he could maybe overthrow Javonte as the season goes along. So Jaleel McLaughlin, maybe you don't need to start him as a flex. You're not in too deep of a league who needs that right now, but I do think it's someone you should absolutely at least have on the end of your bench, and let's see what happens this week.
Cowboys and the Browns. It's a big one. It's the Tom Brady broadcasting debut. A lot of fantasy implications here, John.
But I do believe Ross Tucker got the better game to call than Tom Brady. I think this one's going to be ugly, Ross, just based on how these teams are trending against one another. The Cowboys have a 19.5-point team total at Vegas Sportsbooks and are starting a third-round rookie, Cooper Beebe, at center in front of Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle, who the coaching staff has said has three-down capabilities. They're reportedly even pulling Dowdle off special teams to give him more work, but as underdogs, Hayden Winks was the first to note, Dowdle's only handled 150-plus touches in 1 out of 7 seasons dating back to high school. He's never been that every-touch guy. I will say, at least for this game, it doesn't look like Dalvin Cook is getting the call up in time, and so it will probably be week 2 or later until he's promoted from the team's practice squad. So now is as good of time as any to at least get a hard look at what Rico Dowdle can do against this formidable Cleveland defense. On the other side of the ball, though, what we're really trying to figure out is who is Deshaun Watson, given that he's been obviously very poor in his Browns career so far and dealt with multiple injuries. Having said that, he still averaged over 3 rushing points per game, adding his legs and tacking on top 24 production as position that way. The real key here is the splits in what happens with Deshaun Watson under center. Because last year, for example, David Njoku had the biggest impact, literally leaping from the tight end 1 in fantasy with Joe Flacco and from Watson, the tight end 26. A universe apart from his production whenever Flacco was under center. So we're still starting Amari Cooper and David Njoku in this game, but I am trying to see what is the difference in production going to be.
Next up, we've got the Commanders and the Bucks. Let's start with the Bucks, John.
This game is maybe my most interesting one of the week because Washington last year allowed a league-high rate of explosive plays, 15-yard gains through the air. And although they made a couple splash signings in their front 7, Dorrance Armstrong following, Dan Quinn over from Dallas, Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu, a terrific run-stopping linebacker coming over from Carolina, they actually didn't add a single impact piece in their secondary. So although I'm down on the Bucks for the whole season without Dave Canales, I do think Chris Godwin returning to the slot, where in 3 years from the slot, yes, it was from Tom Brady, but he still finished as a top 20 wide receiver in points per game in all 3 of those seasons. Him returning to the slot, and Mike Evans, of course, dominating man coverage on the outside. I think Mike Evans, Godwin, and Baker Mayfield can have a lot of success in this game, much more so than Rachaad White, who I'm expecting to struggle against this upgraded front 7.
Okay, what about the Commanders, John? I actually wrote an article this week for the 33rd team talking about the Commanders as my surprise team this year, saying that they've got the best chance to be this year's Texans. Agree or not?
I agree, and I hope you pick the money line for this game because that's where I'm on. And my sleeper pick of the week is Jaden Daniels, based on how the Bucks, I assume, are going to play him on defense. Because this Bucks defense under Todd Bowles leaked the 5th highest rate of 15-yard gains and 4th most yards per attempt from week 6 on last year, and then went into this offseason and only lost Shaq Barrett, Devin White, and Carlton Davis at cornerback. Tremendous losses. I don't think they have a choice but to continue leaning on that 3rd highest blitz rate that they depended on to gain pressure last year. And if that is the case, we have to note that Jaden Daniels was 3rd in the nation with a 71% completion rate and 10.9 yards per attempt against the blitz this year. The Commanders obviously have questions as their second wide receiver, but for right now, Terry McLaurin and Daniels look like one of the elite stacks of Week 1 fantasy football.
John's sleeper pick of the week is presented by DraftKings. DraftKings, the crown is yours. My pick of the week is you guys coming tonight to Danny's in Orchard Park. Anybody in Western New York to drink some Labatt Blue Lights with me and live life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. All right, let's talk Sunday night football. It's the Rams and the Lions, a rematch of that epic playoff game that I was on the sideline for last year. The first playoff win for the Lions in 30-some years. What are you thinking for this one, John?
I actually think it's going to be a slightly slower paced game than last year's wild card round that, of course, got everyone excited, especially after Puka Nacua blew up in his first playoff appearance. And let's start with the Rams side of the ball because of that, since Nacua has been dealing with that knee injury over the last month, and we're just now sure how much or if he'll be limited at all in this game. But I do know the Rams' 3 wide receiver sets changed once Demarcus Robinson overthrew Tutu Atwell from week 12 on. And in that sprint, when they had Demarcus Robinson, Puka, and Cooper Kupp all on the field together, the target shares were actually negligible. Puka still led the team with a 24.5% target share, but Cooper Kupp was right behind him at 23%, and DeMarcus filling in at 18%, and also leading the team in end zone targets in that time. So I do think, given Nakua's injury, that Cooper Kupp is the player who's going to score the most fantasy points out of the Rams' target tree this week. And I am not worried as much as everyone else, at least as it pertains to week 1, about Kyren Williams being thrown on the team's kick returning duty. I still believe as long as he's healthy, he's a player we can depend on for 18-plus touches per game, and Blake Corum, the rookie they drafted, is not someone we're even considering flexing, at least for this week.
On the other side, when the Lions have the ball?
We know what to expect from Jared Goff and Ben Johnson. It's still going to run through Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta. Jahmyr Gibbs sounds like he's good to go for this one as well. So between David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, we know exactly how Jared Goff's going to attack. Nothing to surprise here, honestly, Ross, except the fact that we're just going to look and see how Jameson Williams' development is in 2 wide receiver sets. Because at the very least, over 50% of his catches to his career to date, although he hasn't had many, have gained 10-plus yards. He's shown that when he's on the field, he's an explosive player. He just obviously hasn't had much reps to this point. But he's going to be on the field for at least 80% of the team snaps. I think he could deliver at least flex value in this game in week 1.
And you're not worried about Gibbs' hamstring?
I don't think anyhow that he's going to be used as an every down back. Last year, in their last 10 games, whenever the Lions returned from their bye, including the postseason, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery played together. And David Montgomery actually had 10 more touches in that time than Gibbs. The way they use Gibbs, especially on passing downs, I don't think it's something that limits him. Maybe it limits him in efficiency, but he'll still be out there for the reps. And because of that, perhaps not an RB1 this week, but not someone we're benching, still an RB2.
Monday Night Football, last but not least, Jets and the Niners, John.
I know this isn't a betting show, but we're still getting bad vibes from the 49ers early on, in particular heading into this one. Trent Williams and Brandon Ayuk ending their holdouts, fortunately, ahead of this game, but still not practicing with the team, not getting live reps at all throughout training camp. Also, again, not a betting show, but the Super Bowl loser is 4-19-1 against the spread since 2000. We're also getting a Jets offense who, at least for week 1, will be at full health and have a significantly improved unit in the trenches, including Tyron Smith, whichever side they choose to play him. Breece Hall last year was a top 5 running back in points per game behind a significantly worse offensive line and without Aaron Rodgers. So on this one, Breece Hall, I believe, just puts his stamp on the season as someone who's going to rival both Christian McCaffrey and Bijan Robinson as the overall RB1 in fantasy. And for the 49ers side of the ball, we'll see what happens with Williams and Ayuk officially in the lineup. But I do think Deebo Samuel is the one who could have more success given the way the Jets play defense and, of course, George Kittle's whack-a-mole production, hoping that he becomes at least a tight end 1 here rather than the sporadic games he showed us where he fell off the map.
I love it. Fantastic work, John. So fired up to be working with you. Check out the rest of his work at establishtherun.com. Use that code FEAST for 5% off. He's at Not J Daigle. I'm at Ross Tucker NFL. We're at Ross Tucker Pod. We're stuffed. We're done.
Thanks for tuning in to Fantasy Feast. Make sure to also check out the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, Even Money, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.